I paint a lot. It is my favorite thing to do. And in those thousands and thousands and thousands of painting hours clocked, I have developed quite the system of how I like to do things. It's very different. It's very weird because I'm very self-taught and I'm wrong-handed. I'm a filthy lefty. And so I paint in a very weird way, but my big thing is I like to go fast. I want to see a project come together in a timely fashion, and everything I do is kind of built around that goal. Recently, I was doing some painting and I was really analyzing why I do the things that I do. And I want to take you guys through those things, the step-by-step of exactly how I paint a miniature. I want to go through all of the nitty and the gritty of how I like to paint. First things first, starting with the tools of painting, I have my wet palette. You can just about read it, Masterson's Stay Wet Handy Palette. As you can see, this thing is very, very well loved. Never been cleaned, but I don't find it necessary to clean this. All of this texture that has built up over the years, I actually find really handy. And speaking of handy, the other things I find handy to keep around is clean brush water. I like to have a playing card. I like a little piece of paper towel that I double fold, so I'm left with this nice little rectangle. And I keep extra clean water in a little squeezy bottle nearby. Now, the first thing I do every painting session is I prepare my palette. This is actually left over from yesterday and it's pretty dried out, but it's still hanging in there. I still have all of this lovely usable space, and when I run my finger over the palette, I can feel the moisture, but it's not wet. I could probably bring this back to life, but I want to show you what I do with a fresh palette. Step 1 is a clean sponge and clean water. Clean sponge, this looks atrocious, but actually this is just old dried paint, and if I rub on it, it's not coming off anywhere. This is all perfectly clean, and if you look, there's actually quite a bit of standing water in this palette, and that is the water that I'm actually using for painting. The sponge doesn't hold my water, the tray holds my water, and all the sponge does is provide a surface for my palette paper to sit on. And speaking of that palette paper, I like to use grocery store parchment paper. This is, I think, just Kroger brand parchment paper, and I've ran it under the sink for just a little bit to get it nice and soft and saturated. And I lay it down on my palette. When I get it from the grocery store in a roll, I tape it up, and then I have it like this, and I hacksaw it to be the exact length I like it to be for my Masterson's wet palette. My palette paper is laying flat and it's starting to absorb the water from my palette, but I've got all of these bubbles, and those bubbles are no good. All of these bubble spots are gonna start to dry out, and as they dry out, this paper is gonna wanna pucker, and I don't want that. So there's a really easy way to fix this, and that is with this playing card, or anything flat really, and you just squeegee the air out from under the paper. It'll make it lay so incredibly smooth and flat and be the perfect surface to work off of. Now I'm almost done. I just like to take my paper towel and just run it over the surface of my paper just to get rid of any little droplets of water that might have stuck around that could be a little time bomb when I'm actually painting and my brush could soak up that extra water. Just getting this nice and pristine. It also looks like I need just a little bit more water. I can see there's water in the sponge, but I don't see it pooling up around the edges, so just gonna squirt in a little bit more water. Now my palette is perfect, and you can see I've left a fair bit of sponge naked, and that's not by accident. When I'm painting, I like to take water from the sponge and put it onto my palette or put it onto my paint. And this is also the perfect spot to let decals soak and soften. And so I like to have a little bit of sponge showing. I'm a little fussy when it comes to my paint palette. I'm a little fussy when it comes to every part of the painting process, because I find if I do a good job with every single step, everything works out much smoother. A teacher of mine in college told me that the difference between an amateur and a professional is not quality, but speed. And I find that to be very true. Quality is a given because you're trying to do a good job, but if you do every part of the craft really well, then you can get into that flow really easily. The better job I do prepping a miniature, making sure that there's no mold lines, finding every sprue nubby and filling every gap, is gonna help me out later in the painting process, where with one coat of speed paint, I can throw it on and knock it out, as opposed to putting on a coat of speed paint and then correcting the one little spot where it pooled next to a seam line a little weirdly. Now my palette is ready to rock and roll, and I'm ready to rock and roll, but how do I rock and roll? I have a little bit of a different painting stance than most people. Most people like the tripod system, where you've got arm, and then your hands come together and you paint like this. And this works, but I find it's not very comfortable, especially at the beginning. I'm doing a good job with my posture, but then by the end, I'll be all scrunched up trying to paint like this. I just do not find this very good. Some of you will notice that this desk is weird and tall, and that is because it is weird and tall. This tabletop is 3 feet off of the ground, and it's that way for a very specific reason. It is so that my arms can be up and flat on the table. I got my elbows out, my chest is open, and my hands are resting comfortably flat on the table. They're not going anywhere, and really the only thing doing any movement at all is my fingies. My right hand holds the miniature and then it just sits there dead on the table. And then my left hand that's holding the brush is the only thing moving and doing any work. With my right hand, I set the mini on my pinky and ring finger and I just let it sit there. Then with my middle finger and my thumb, these are the fingers that clamp down on the mini, but I do almost no pressure. I never need to. These are the fingers that manipulate the model if I need to turn it around or anything, but other than that, it just sits there. And then with my index finger, I let the model lean back on it. And so I've got basically all of my fingers clamping down on the mini. And because this hand is just sitting there like a lump on the table, there is absolutely no wiggle and woggle. This is why I really like these little cubes of wood as a paint holder or as a model holder with a little double stick tape. This works really well for just letting it sit in my hand, and it gives tiny miniatures a little bit more space to actually hold on to. Another thing I really like are the cobalt keep handles because they're pretty small. And so with these, I can do almost the same thing. I usually let it sit on the table and then I just lean it back into my hand. And then my index finger, the model just lays right back on top of it and then I clamp it down. This is exactly how I hold miniatures and I've never had an issue. Now I've got my model held securely in my right hand and my left hand does all the work. Now, the way I hold brush is a little bit weird. I like to pinch the brush in between these 3 fingers, a little bit like a chopstick. I feel like a lot of people paint the way that they write, a little bit like this, but this is how it's comfortable for me. And then these 2 fingers down here bridge the gap between my 2 hands. And so if I want to paint on this figure, I'll take these 2 fingers and I'll rest them on my other hand. Sometimes I'll even reach over and I'll grab my other hand with those fingers just to hold everything nice and tight. And then when I'm painting, I find I usually have the brush held in these fingertips when I'm painting up. And then if I'm painting down, I'll switch to the thumb and the pointer finger holding the brush and resting it on the middle finger. And this is if I'm painting down. I don't know exactly why I do this, but I just find it a little bit more comfortable. If I'm painting up, it's like this, and if I'm painting down, it's like this. If I'm painting down here on the model's base, I might rest my pinky finger, and so this hand, on my other pinky finger, so that I'm working down here. If I'm working a little bit higher, I might rest it all on my ring finger, so that I can work a little bit higher. And then if I'm working up here on the mini, I'll rest this hand on my middle finger, and then I'm in a nice spot to be working all down here. I find keeping my hands this way really lets me do a lot of damage. A lot of these techniques I learned just trying to paint on camera, because it's actually really tricky to paint on camera. It's hard to focus on a teeny tiny miniature. And so the model is in focus right here. Now it's not in focus. But this system of resting, everything is resting. My hands are resting on the table, the model is resting in my hands, is actually a really relaxing and comfortable way to paint. And since the model is just right here in front of me, exactly 1 brush distance away from my eyes, I don't have to strain or choke up on the mini or do anything. It's all just boom, right there in front of me. With my hand position, I'm always trying to get as much contact as I possibly can. So if I've got this model in there and I'm really trying to get at that figure's face, I might rest my pinky and my ring finger on the model itself. I'll really get them in there and then clamp them down with my thumb. And then these 3 fingers can just get right in there. I might even rest this finger on the model itself. Then the only thing that is open is the tip of my brush, and I've got it all resting on the model, so I can really get in there and just hit that eye, and there's no wiggling, there's no shaking, nothing can shake. I've got everything really clamped down. And so this is what I do when I really have to get in there. This model is Tito from Moonstone, and she is about the size of an M&M. So I find locking all of my fingers together and resting as much as I can really helped me to be able to get my brush into all of these little spots and to paint that tiny, tiny face and the little eyebrows and this little dagger that she's gonna shank somebody with. This is how I hold a model and how I put paintbrush to a model, but the next step is actual paint. When I put paint on the palette, I try to put down as little as I can get away with, just as much as I think I'm gonna use. I put down a little blobby, and then I soak up some water from this paint palette, and then I transfer that to my blob of paint. It comes out of the bottle pretty gel-like, but then I work in some water to thin it down just the right amount. When I'm taking paint from a pot, like a GW pot or this coat d'arms, I like to take the back of my brush and then take a little bit of paint, a big drop off of the lip, and then I transfer that to my palette and then I roll it on. I'm trying to squeegee off as much paint so that there's not a lot of wastage. Then I can just grab some water, mix it into my paint, and then work with it. As you can see, I've done this a lot with this brush, and if I take my knife and I cut into this blobby, you can see all of the different layers of paint underneath. It kind of looks cool. It reminds me of Fordite. Look at all those weird little paint layers getting revealed. In terms of thinning your paint, there's no magic bullet way to know you've thinned it enough. Different types of painting is gonna require different amounts of water in your paint, but a good rule of thumb is if you can take your paint and you put in enough water that when you paint it onto your hand, you can easily see the texture of your skin underneath. I can almost dry brush and leave the paint only on the top parts of my skin. When the paint is like that, it is properly thinned, and you could apply 10, 20, 30 layers of this much paint to a model, and it won't visibly start to look gunky or build up. If you put some paint on your hand and it's covering up or filling in the texture of your skin, then the paint is too thick. The thicker paint is, the better coverage it's gonna have. You can see, I could probably get this white and black covered up in maybe 2 or 3 coats of pretty thick paint, where if I thinned it down, it's gonna have a much harder time covering that up. But sometimes that's good. Like if I just want to add a little tinge of orange to my model, I would definitely want to be using really nice and watery paint. But sometimes if I'm going for coverage, I will let that paint be just a little bit thicker to try to cover something up. When I'm loading up my brush, I don't just take paint and then go. I always work some water and some paint into the brush. I like to do little waves and little circles, and sometimes I'll pull the paint, and I really want to work it into those bristles. And then when I've fully got that brush loaded up with paint, then I'll leave. And when I got that brush loaded up with paint, sometimes I'm not even done, and I'll paint a little bit on my finger to wick away a little bit of that extra paint and to sharpen that tip to a really, really sharp point before I am ready to put something down on the model. And if my brush ever starts to misbehave or the bristles start to come apart, I can go back to my finger and just resharpen that brush. And then I can go back to painting the figure. When I've run out of paint, I don't go immediately to clean my brush in the water. Usually I'll go right back to the palette and just pick up more. I go a long time between fully cleaning my brush off with the water. Usually the only time I'll clean is if my brush is really misbehaving, or if I've completely finished with that color and I'm ready to move on to a mix or an entirely different color. Sometimes I'll even have a little bit of liquid paint on my hand, and I'll actually go back to that liquid paint. This is also handy because the paint on your brush is still separating and is still alive and active. And so sometimes, especially if I'm working with a mixture, that mixture will start to get a little bit too red or a little bit too creamy. And so then on my finger, I'll remix them just to make sure that that paint is coming off exactly the way I want it to. Going right back to my fingy, picking up a little bit of that paint that's almost dried. I am remixing the paint on my brush and I'm working that tip back into a really, really fine point before I get it onto the mini. Now to really work the paint like this, I like to use bigger brushes. This is a Rosemary & Co. Synthetic Series 313 size 3. This is one of my all-time favorite brushes. I think I've been through 3 or 4 of these over the past just about 10 years, and I absolutely love these brushes. Also, available from EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is full of hobby goodies, and we now have Army Painter paints. We got Speed Paint, Fanatic, bundles, and we also have my favorite Vallejo texture pastes. If you're looking for paint, we got it, along with all sorts of other hobby goodies, and terrain. It's the best way to support us doing what we do by getting a membership. Each month, members get a credit for any of our past sets or this month's new terrain. Come celebrate Orktober with us and head on down to the Orc Rodeo. A whimsical assortment of high-octane hijinks, this set includes a series of walls and barricades that not only create a coliseum of chaos, but also fits in with our previous Orky wall terrains. Then there are the Goblin game carts, a series of mobile orc entertainments pulled along by an orcified food truck, literally dripping with some good orc grub. Rounding out this set are the 3 amigos, some brave goblins riding their violently bucking steeds. All this terrain was designed by us and is available at EonsOfBattle.com. Now this brush here is a very nice brush, but its niceness is not what makes it a great brush. It being the right tool for the right job is what makes it great. This is a great brush for working in all of the fine details on poor little Joby here, but it is not the perfect tool for every instance. One tool I love are these super ratty, super beat up synthetic brushes. Look at this, I've stepped on this brush and so it's basically broken, but I use this brush almost every day, and it's that roughness that I like about it. This crummy brush is a perfect brush for speed paint, and speed paint is a tool that I use on just about every model I paint. When I put some speed paint on my palette, I like to put down about 3 drops, and then I'll always put at least 1 drop of speed paint medium in there, because I find almost all the colors are a little too strong right out of the gate. Then I take my gunky brush and I mix that in real good, and I try to fully load this brush, and this yucky brush can hold a lot of paint, which is really important. When I'm putting speed paint on a miniature, I want to flood the spot that I want to put this on as quickly as possible. I took off a little bit of the excess paint just so it's not super runny, and then I try to hit the spot I want to hit, fully dunk it in paint as quickly as I can. And so I want to get this paint everywhere. Get it on this shoe too. And this big wad of a brush is really going to help me put down some serious paint quickly. And it's important to do it in a timely fashion because I want to give that paint plenty of time to settle into the recesses. And now I can watch it and see how it's settling. A little bit is pooling right here, and I can just wick that away. Let me check the back. Ooh, I didn't get the back. Gotta get plenty of paint down. And then I want that paint to have time wet on the model so that it separates, and so it flows away from the high spots and fills in the low spots. A little bit of paint is pooling behind his foot, and I want to come back and wick that away. The reason that this big junky brush is so good for this is because it can hold a lot of paint and get it off the brush really quickly. If I tried to put down some speed paint with my really nice sharp brush, I'm painting little lines, and I can crush my bristles down to get the fat belly to be touching my palette a little bit quicker, but it's still, I'm having trouble and I'm having to paint on the speed paint. But when I use a big junky brush, boom, I can immediately put down a ton of paint really fast and give it that time to be wet and to be flowy. Also, this is a much more rough and tumble operation, and so I feel much better using and abusing these old ratty brushes than abusing one of my nice brushes, because the important thing about my nice brushes is that tip. I want that razor tip, and I want to keep that as nice as possible. But if I don't need a razor tip, then I'm just going to use one of these suckers. Another really nice brush to have hanging around is one of these guys. This is a Rosemary & Co. and also available from EonsOfBattle.com. But this is a brush with hilariously long bristles. And very similar to the junky brushes, this is a brush that can hold a lot of paint and flood sections of the model, but this is what I use when I need a little bit of precision with that flooding. I can load up the bristles with a little bit of speed paint, get rid of that excess that just wants to drip off of the model, and then with this long bristle brush, I can have a little bit more precision when I am trying to get that paint onto the model in a timely fashion. The long bristles I can work in between this guy's fingers, and I can avoid the things that I need to avoid, and I can get the paint to flow off of the brush into the spots that I want it to flow into. I've got Joby completely covered in speed paint, and now I can keep an eye on it, and I can wick away the paint anywhere where it's pooling just a little too much, like in between these two fingers. I want to yoink off a little bit of that paint before it's fully dried. I want to put down just a little bit more here. When I try to do this operation with my nice brush, that paint has to flow out of the belly and onto the figure, where when I try this operation with this long bristle brush, it'll absolutely dump that paint fast. It doesn't look that crazy different, but minis aren't that crazy big, and being able to put down this big blobby in a split second versus this little spot, that makes a big difference when it comes to painting. When I'm mixing two colors together, I like to take a little scoop of paint A and a little scoop of paint B, and I put them somewhere else in my palette, and then I swirl them together. And I swirl and I swirl. I'll pick up a little bit of extra water as needed from my sponge and then put it into the paint, and I'll work it together and really look at it. If I need to add a little bit more of one color, I can do that, and then just keep swirling and swirling. A little bit more water until I get that whole blob one nice even finish. Maybe a little more of A. Sometimes I gotta take from the edges and kind of push that paint into a little pile at the middle. And then as I'm swirling, I like to roll my brush to deposit a little blob of that color. That blob is gonna survive where a lot of the stuff that's pushed around is gonna dry up. It won't dry up immediately. I've probably got about 10 minutes of working time on this little pile, but that little blobby in the middle, that might last about an hour. And so I can just take from that. Then I go back to little Joby, and this brush is fully loaded, and there's about 1 drop of paint that is sitting right at the tip, and I want to deposit that on my finger to get the flow of paint started. And then I can take that and I can paint it right onto Joby. And this is a pretty big brush, so I actually have quite a bit of paint and quite a bit of time to work with this color. On the wet palette, not all paints are created equally. Regular old opaque paints will last a fair bit of time, especially the blobbies. If you can leave your paint as blobbies and then just take from them to make your mixes, that's the best way to make your paints last a really long time. And even these spread out sections, they're not gonna last as long as the blobs, but you can keep refreshing them by taking more paint from the sponge and putting it and mixing it into the paint. Speed paints and contrast paints don't last nearly as long on the palette. You get about 10 or 15 minutes of working time, and then the edges start to dry up and get gummy, and the middle areas absorb a lot of water from the sponge. So when I use speed paint and contrast paint, I like to try to use them up quickly as opposed to leaving them on the palette all day. When I start to paint, I'll usually start out with a fairly thick blobby color of paint. This will lay down and cover really nicely. And then when I want a thinner version of this color, I won't clean my brush, I'll just take on some more water and kind of work that water into the paint I'm already working with. Then I can use this watery mix to feather out some of the work I just did. As I'm feathering out that work, the paint is coming off of my brush, and then once it's all gone, I can go back and grab some more thick paint and then start the whole process over again. While I'm working with the same color or even mixes of the same color, I'll just keep using the brush over and over and over, not cleaning it, but just adding in a little bit more water and a little bit more paint over and over and over until I'm completely done with this color. Then once I'm completely done with the color, then I go ahead and I grab my cup of water. This shouldn't be in there. I like to change out the water from my cup pretty frequently to keep it clean. I would say if you dip your brush in and you can't see your brush under the surface of the water, it's more than past time to change out your water. Also, it's important to work with clean water because sometimes the paint in your cup can get onto your mini. If I'm trying to paint a mini white, but previously I used red or blue paint and my water is really disgusting, I could bring a little bit of that blue and red onto my new mini. And if you ever use any chemicals or varnishes or God forbid glue, you want to change out that paint water immediately. I have shortened the lifespan of some very nice brushes, putting them into contaminated water. Changing out your brush water often is going to be the #1 way to keep your brushes alive for the longest amount of time. At least every half hour or so, you want to change that paint water. You want the water in there to be clean enough that it's taking the paint out of the bristles, And it's not, if it's dirty, then it's gonna introduce paint back into the bristles and it's gonna be up into the furl. And you really wanna keep paint out of the furl, the little metal bit of the paintbrush. Honestly, I don't really clean my brushes very often. The only time I really clean my brushes is when I notice them misbehaving. When I'm getting a lot of splitting with the tip, or if I physically see dry paint on my brushes, then I clean them. When I do clean my brushes, I like to use this Masters brush cleaner. This is just soap, and you can see it's pretty cratered, and I don't just swirl my brushes in there like that. The reason that it's so cratered is from cleaning my dry brushes. My dry brushes take a lot more abuse, and for these guys, I scrub them all around that soap. But when I'm working on my nice brushes, I like to just take a little bit of soap. Then I take that little bit of soap and I introduce a little bit of water, and I just work that soap into a little lather on my hand. And then I use that soapy water on my brush. I just paint my hand back and forth, working that paint into that soap into the bristles, and then hopefully working the paint out of the bristles. I might do some swirlies. Usually I'll do all my brushes at once, and I'll clean my brushes a few times a year. More if they're being fussy. Then I get that soap off of there and some clean water. I have one of those silicone pucks that you put in your water cup that has these little dimples on it that you can run your bristles against, and then it helps to clean them. And once I have a clean brush, then comes the important part. Now my bristles are clean, but they're very, very dry, and I don't want my bristles to be dry. I like this Gentastics Drunken Brush Goo, and I just wet my brush, and then I rub my brush against this stuff. And this stuff might look just like tuna fish, but it's got some sort of oils in it that condition your bristles. And I really want to condition those bristles because that's what gives you that nice sharp point. I lather up my brush like this, and then I use my hand to pull those bristles into a nice sharp point. And when I'm done cleaning, I want the bristles really, really sharp because I want the brush to want to be in that hypodermic needle sharpness. And that's how I want to put the brush away so that it's perfect for next time. I don't clean my brushes that much, and it's not just because I'm lazy, but also I think it's bad to over clean your brushes. I actually think it's important to clean your brushes just as much as is necessary, because the really important thing is to keep your bristles conditioned. You want to keep that nice sharp point, and you want that sharp point to always exist while you're painting, while the brush is put away, because you want that shape to be remembered by the brush. This is my Synthetic Series 313 that is well conditioned, and when I dip it into the water, it holds its shape perfectly, and it's just as sharp in the water as outside of the water. This is another brush I have that I do not have very well conditioned, and so when I dip it into the water, you see those bristles want to open up. And that is showing me that these bristles are very, very dry, and this needs a lot more conditioning to get that tip to be nice and strong. Natural hair brushes tend to be a little bit more needy in terms of maintenance, and they're a little less forgiving when you don't do that maintenance, which is kind of why I prefer synthetics. And they work about the same, so if I know myself and I know I'm a bad brush dad, then I should just use the synthetics because these guys have got me covered. These two little fellas I painted up not that long ago. This little pug rider is Doug the Flatulent, and this fun little fella is the Goblin King. And on the Goblin King, I used a Winsor Newton Series 7 brush, which is a very nice natural hair brush. And for good old Doug here, I used one of my good old synthetic brushes, and I don't notice any difference. I think they both came out excellent. In the painting process, I didn't really notice a difference, so I'm just gonna keep on using my synthetics. Leave a comment if you can tell the difference. Leave a comment if you can tell that I lied. Doug is the Winsor Newton and Goblin King is the synthetic brush. There's no difference, they're exactly the same. If I was gonna take a break from painting, I would take the lid of my wet palette and I would put it over the majority of the palette, still leaving a little bit of room for airflow to get in there and for the evaporating water to get out. If I was done painting for the day, I would not then close up my palette. I never close up the wet palette if I intend to come back to it, because I find that when it's sealed up tight, the evaporating water can't escape, and so then it just gets absorbed into the paint that's on the top of the palette. And if I were to close it up and then come back to it later, I would find my paints waterlogged and pretty much unusable. That's why I try to use as small amount of paint as I can so that I don't end up wasting anything, because it's always better just to start fresh than to try to fight and fuss with a really worn out palette. As I'm painting, particularly in a longer painting session, I will continue to add a little bit of water to my palette as it starts to dry out. I always want to look for plenty of standing water in my palette so that there's plenty of water for the paint to absorb through the paper. There are some things that I won't put on the wet palette, like enamel paints. Enamel is incompatible with water, so you can't put this on the wet palette. And another thing is Dirty Down products. Dirty Down products are water soluble, but they're a little fussy, and so I like to keep them separate from my regular paints. Sometimes I'll use the top of my wet palette as a dry palette, or in the case of Dirty Down, which is kind of stinky, I will use the playing card as a temporary disposable dry palette. And so I'll put this stuff onto here, do my mixing with water, and I'll use this as a palette, and then once I'm done, I'll just toss this in the garbage. That is how I paint. That is how I do what I do. And what I do is paint for about 8 hours a day, most days. I really enjoy painting, and honestly, it's kinda quick. Like, I do put hours and hours and hours into painting, but it's one of the most enjoyable parts of the hobby. When I'm sitting down and I am taking the paint from the palette and I am putting it onto the figure, that actual operation is pretty darn quick, and I really see the model come into life in front of me. Where other hobby things, like cleaning resin or scraping mold lines or building figures or kit bashing or creating bases, pinning models, masking, doing decals, those sorts of things also take a fair bit of time, and you don't necessarily see the model getting done in front of you the way you do when you're painting. I like to work fast, but it's not the same thing as rushing. I like to have every part of my painting really efficient, because then I can just get right into the painting zone. Pop in some headphones, get a podcast going, grab some minis, and get some minis done. Let me know in the comments below, what are some of your guys' painting eccentricities? What is a part of your workflow? And let me know if you try out painting like this with the elbows up. I find it really, really comfy, but your mileage may vary. Thanks for watching.